And welcome back, everyone. Today I just wanted to make a brief video about the Grand Chess Tour, which just concluded in Zagreb, Croatia, which was a very interesting event because it was extremely strong. There was Magnus Carlsen, of course, playing. There was Caruana, there was Gukesh, the current world champion, Pragg, so many strong players. And it was a very, very close field overall. And Magnus only won the event by quite a small margin, at least compared to other events which he has won in the past. And he also said in numerous interviews that it was maybe that he was not in his best form, and there was also the joke that Magnus is still the second best player in the world, even if he's not in his best shape, which I guess is sort of true, but still I think that his performance overall is kind of underestimated by many, and I think also including himself, because there were many games I was quite impressed with, which of course almost everyone is whenever Magnus is playing chess. But there were a couple of games which I found really, really nice. And this is one of them, which you can see right in the board right now. This was against Gukesh in the Blitz section. Overall, Gukesh played fantastic in the rapid section, which he won, which no one really anticipated, because usually he's... people think, at least about him, that, well, his major strength is classical, which is, I think, undoubtedly true, that classical is his main strength. But people just underestimate his capabilities also in rapid and blitz. In blitz, he did not play so well, but in rapid, he won by a huge margin. In the very end, Magnus, of course, won the overall standings, so he won the event after all. But it was quite close overall. Wesley So had a great event as well, and young Krzysztof Duda from Poland as well. And I really enjoyed watching the coverage in general. And this, I just wanted to show you this game quickly. It's because I thought it was quite beautiful and also very instructive. So Magnus had the white pieces against Gukesh in the blitz section. It was round number 13, I believe. And we are just jumping in after the opening. It came from an anti-Berlin defense. And here, after Magnus just played bishop g5, h6, and bishop h4, Gukesh now went for the move bishop g4. And I think this is where things kind of started to go a bit wrong for him, because in general in this line, what Black is arguing is mostly for the bishop pair, and of course also for the solid structure. But if Black doesn't have the bishop pair, then in most cases White can hope for some advantage, just because White has the better pawn structure, and those pawns can sometimes be not the best. And with bishop g4, Gukesh is kind of saying that he's giving away the bishop pair. So instead of this, a move like queen e7 would have probably been better. And after White castles short, then you can really play g5. Knight takes g5 will not be dangerous, because you can just step away with the queen and then move the knight. And apart from that, if bishop g3, something like bishop g4, and with this pin here, maybe I would even take Black here. Of course, Magnus doesn't have to castle. He can also go for some slower play like knight d2, but in general, Black should surely keep the bishop pair on the board here. But bishop g4 was played, and now h3, and now already bishop cannot really go back because White hasn't castled yet, and after g4, the bishop would have to drop back to g6, and White can start attacking with g5 or just reroute a knight to f5, and the bishop on g6 is just quite passive. So Gukesh took on f3, and after queen takes f3, bishop e7. So Black is of course still not much worse or anything, but White has definitely achieved something out of the opening. And here I quite like Magnus's decision. He just took on f6 and gave away his bishop, and he was arguing that he just wants the scenario of good knight against bad bishop. And of course the bishop on f6 is not so great, because the pawn on e5 is also on a dark square. It's not entirely necessary, like the computer says that also after castle or bishop g3 moves like that, White is a bit better. But I find the decision very interesting and also very practical, especially considering that it's a blitz game. Bishop takes f6, and now I really like how Magnus played it. He played g3, intending to go h4 on the next move, which also happened, just further restricting the bishop on f6. So the game continued, bishop e7, short castle, of course. If Black were to get bishop b4 and then trade the bishop against the knight, White wouldn't have anything at all. So short castle, bishop c5, and now king g2 was played. So very natural but useful moves for Magnus. So he's just making these small moves which are yeah, just improving the position little by little. Now Gukesh played bishop d4, which isn't entirely useful because of knight e2, but it's not easy at all to see it in Blitz that b2 is just not hanging here, because after rook b1, then b7 is also going to fall, which is only going to help white. So then Gukesh played bishop b6. Actually, Garry Kasparov said in the live broadcast where he was there, that was also fantastic to watch, that he didn't like the decision to put the bishop back to b6 because it could also be useful on the king side later on, which I think is a very interesting statement. So according to him, bishop c5 would have maybe been a better move. Computers don't fully agree, but I think that the general idea is quite correct, because in some cases you do like to have the bishop on the king side. But Gukesh played bishop b6, which is, of course, not a bad move itself. In general, the position is very slow, so even in some cases you could just go back with the bishop. And now Magnus played another very interesting decision, which is the move g4. Not entirely necessary just yet, but he just wants to eliminate any counterplay with f5, which black might have. Another move which I quite like is queen f5, might also be a good move. And then, well, if black captures, then white has a very nice endgame. We'll try to get the knight to e4 somehow. And if the queen would move, then you could think about playing h5, for example, and not commit to the move g4 just yet. But Magnus played g4, also an interesting move, and now Gukesh played the move g6, which is quite logical, just trying to cover the square in f5. The computer says that rook ae8 and not committing to g6 might be a tad bit better, and similar to the game, black has ideas like rook e6 followed by rook f6. But Gukesh played g6, also a sound move, knight to g3, and now queen e7, and here it might have really been time to reroute the bishop. So here Garry, of course, was right that the bishop might be quite useful on e7 later on. But Gukesh played queen e7, rook h1, and rook a8, which is also quite a good plan to try and get the rook to d6 and then to f6. Now Magnus played a4, a5, queen to e2, rook d6. So this was Gukesh's plan, just trying to get the rook to f6, which is a defender on the one hand, but also an attacker since it is looking on this f2 pawn. Queen e2 was played, king g7, and now h5, which I also quite like, because now black is kind of forced to enter the endgame after queen g5, since this threat of taking on g6 is quite big, because then h6 would be hanging, and of course black can never move the g-pawn, because then knight f5 is coming. Even if it wouldn't fork everything, it would still be strategically quite horrible for black to allow the knight to getting to f5. So Gukesh played queen g5, now Magnus took hg5, and now knight f1, another very beautiful move. So Magnus is already kind of hinting at the fact that this knight might want to get to c4 at some moment. And an interesting thing was what was in the live commentary that Garry pointed out, f5 might be interesting here, but Magnus's point surely was that he can just take and then go knight g3. This is a move which I also missed at first. The point is that f4 doesn't work because of the fork, and after f takes e4, knight takes e4, white is just clearly better, because the knight is very powerful on e4, and at the same time it protects the f2 pawn. So that's why Gukesh played rook f6 here, now just f3, and it's just a very nice case of a good knight against a bad bishop, which we see here. The position itself is actually not bad at all yet. Black still has enough for equality, but he has to be extremely precise here. And he played rook f4, which is already, I think, might have been a first misstep. He should really try to look for counterplay with bishop d4. And if the rook goes to b1, trying to defend the pawn, then b5. And at least he's opening some files on the queen side for his rooks. And if rook a2 comes, now b5 wouldn't be as powerful, but black could maybe go after the h5 pawn with rook h8. And he still has enough for equality, even though white's play, of course, should also be easier here. So Gukesh played rook f4, so now he's getting really ready for the move f5, at least in many cases. And that's also why Magnus now decided to take on g6. And after fg6, he has the nice move rook h3, which is just protecting the pawn on f3. And there is no more counterplay on the king side for black. And now Gukesh made the final mistake, which is the move rook h8. Again, it was really time to find counterplay with bishop d4. And then once again, if rook b1 comes, then black can think about b5. And if rook a2, now the rook is at least a little bit misplaced, and it's not so clear how white can make progress here, at least for the moment. But of course, again, white is still for preference even here. But Gukesh played rook h8, and now after takes, Magnus played the final very nice maneuver, which already after the move knight f1 earlier he kind of hinted at, which is the move knight to d2. And all of a sudden we see in how much strategical trouble black is, because this bishop is just quite bad. The pawn on e5 is weak, the pawn on a5 is weak, and the knight is getting to the very beautiful c4 square. So Gukesh played rook f6, knight c4, and now rook e6, still defending the pawn on e5, and now the final plan which Magnus showed, rook to b1. So now he's getting ready to open up the queen side with the move b4, and if black ignores that, for example goes king g7, then just b4, and black is just lost because he's probably just losing the b7 pawn. White could take on b6 even, but let's just demonstrate if black goes king f6. I would even prefer to go a5 here, then take on b7 just to keep this beautiful knight on c4, and white is just completely winning. So Gukesh tried c5, trying to set up a fortress like this, which when I was watching the game live, I was still not entirely sure like how easy it is going to be for white to break through, but yeah, Magnus seemingly did it quite easily. He gave a check on h1, king g7, king f2, and now Gukesh decided to go bishop a7, trying to get c6 and b5 and sacrificing the a5 pawn. Still would be quite interesting to see Magnus's technique if Gukesh would have just waited with king g8. I'm assuming that his idea was just to bring the king to c3. So for example, king g7, king d2, let's just say black continues waiting, and then to go for an idea like this, for example, and then king c4 and knight b3, and hinting to take on c5 at some moment. You could also think to take on b6 at the right moment, at least if black has to take with the pawn. Then the king could run to b5, and technically it should be winning for white, at least that would be my best guess. But here after rook b6 it might not be so easy. So this would have still been interesting to see, but I think that Magnus would have converted this also. Some knight maneuvers at some moment should just be winning, maybe trying to get the knight to d5 as well at some moment. So Gukesh played bishop a7, and now Magnus took his chance to take the pawn on a5, correctly judging that after c4 check, black does not have sufficient counterplay here. Rook d6 check, king c4. Also important that the pawn on b7 is hanging. So rook a6, knight b7, rook takes a4, and now b4, and white is just a clear pawn up, as well as just having the better pieces, and pawn on e5 is still very weak as well. So let's just see how the game concluded. Rook c6 check, king b3, bishop d4, rook d3, another very accurate move, not allowing black to find any counterplay with rook c3 here. And after king f6, c3, bishop f2, rook d7, rook b6, rook takes c7. Here Gukesh resigned. So I don't think this game was really announced anywhere so much, but I really enjoyed the way Magnus was playing it, and I think there were quite a few moments which at least I personally found quite instructive, starting with the fact that, well, first of all, here black should not give up the bishop pair, and I really liked Magnus's decision here to just capture on f6. I think that was just very practical, and I really loved seeing how he just grinded his positional advantage until the very end. So I hope you guys also enjoyed this game coverage. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And apart from that, this was a shorter video than usual, but anyway, I hope it was useful. You can also check out my socials, my website, felixbloberger.com, for more information about anything else. And apart from that, thank you for watching and see you next time.